Resilience. It sounds positive, flexible, and scientific. Do you like the sound of it? Governments, donors, civil society organizations, and corporations have been adopting it as a unifying label for very different agendas, from mental health to climate adaptation. As resilience moved into policy and funding language, it often replaced more political terms like rights, justice, or equality, making it an appealing but vague frame for dealing with crisis and uncertainty. So, what does resilience mean, and what it really takes to defend civic space? Hello everybody. On behalf of the Trust, Accountability and Inclusion Collaborative and the European Centre for Non-for-Profit Law, we welcome you to this special podcast on Rethinking Resilience. I am Ester Filippini, and my colleague here is
Vanya Skoric, and together we will facilitate this conversation. To start us off, we will ask our wonderful guests to introduce themselves, telling their name and affiliation, and of course answer a very brief but important question. What is your immediate vision when you think of resilience? How are you or we or your organization resilient? So maybe we can start with Gabriela.
Thank you. I'm Gabriela Boucher. I lead the Fund for Global Human Rights. It's a good question and a difficult one to answer so quickly, but I think, resilience is in tension with other terms, and I think it's all very contextual. So in shrinking civic space under a lot of pressure, resilience might be important, essential even, but it shouldn't be in the detriment of agency and imagination about what is the possible and a transformative world that one needs to continue struggling for.
Thank you so much for having me today. My name is Grace Maingi, and I work for the Kenya Community Development Foundation, KCDF, out of Nairobi. When I imagine resilience, the picture I have is this woman or man walking in a storm, and they have a raincoat, and then the sun comes out, right? And that raincoat that they've used to cover themselves, they now use it to shade the sun. So being able to navigate different challenges is the imagery, or the way I look at it, just being able to navigate and using what you have where you are, to be able to navigate that. Thanks so much.
Such a beautiful metaphor. Anna Isichko, do you have something more for us?
Hope so. I'm from Ukraine. I'm Deputy Director at the Center for Democracy and Rule of Law. And I think it's easier for me to talk about the resilience because it's already Ukrainian resilience, which is already a brand. And I believe this brand is based on values, braveness, creative thinking, action, cooperation, volunteering, trusted relation, and some caviar on top, a sense of humor and innovations. That's something that I think this blend will be an excellent, maybe Michelin star recipe for how to be resilient when everything seems to be absolutely in shattered realities.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. I'm Nina Madsen. I'm Brazilian and based in Brasilia, and I'm here representing the Mapping Adaptation Project. Well, when I think of resilience, I think somewhat like Grace. I think of a capacity to navigate, right? Navigate the ebbs and flows of life and of a very complex and challenging world. And that capacity, in my view, depends a lot on having a collective to navigate with. And that's exactly what has been surfacing for us in the Mapping Adaptation Project and the research that we've been doing. This capacity to adapt and to innovate amidst a challenging context is directly connected to having safe space to experiment and a peer network to provide support and community.
Hi, I'm Anna. I'm coming from Serbia. I'm the Executive Director of Partners for Democratic Change Serbia, Partners Serbia. So I agree with what someone said, that it's contextual, because if you would ask me 2 years ago, I think I would give completely different answer. It would be striving and being prone to different types of external pressures, but also changes. It could be also positive and negative ones. But now I would say it's survival, but also our ability to withstand and recover from adversities. But I think that it also comes with a price. And I think that price is also something that should be discussed with our community as well.
Thank you for that. And if I may add from my side, I feel resilience as a pathway to freedom. And we can also see how that feeds into our realities. Over to you, Esther.
Thank you. For me, I think resilience, you said so beautiful metaphors that I feel I lost of words. But it is absolutely something that is not individual. It is in our collective, in our communities. It is basically caring for each other. And if that care is around, that will help us to use the raincoat or whatever we have at hand. And I think we still need to hear from Tanya.
I'm Tanya Sanchez with the Civic Engagement and Government's International Program team at the Ford Foundation. When I think of resilience, and I love all the images that you shared, and you're based on your own experiences and everything. Today, particularly, I'm thinking about a biological image where we think it more in terms of evolution and not preservation. So moving away from trying to survive the crisis, the pressure, and instead becoming exactly what this moment of uncertainty requires from each one of us to remain true to our mission, something like the invisible work of building strong organizations, but also an ecosystem that is strong enough to hold its own ground and independence, and that it's independent enough to speak its own truth, even when all the traditional pillars of support are being pulled away. So it's like the realization of that while the world around us is changing, our mission can and must remain non-negotiable.
Thank you so much. These are very complex ideas already to start with. I've heard many that are talking to each other, the pathway to freedom, to independence, to future thinking, to building a collection of approaches, and that it's not just about surviving, but something about a collective and broader mission. And that can be also for organization programs, but also for a bigger picture future mission. So with that, I will let Vanya to ask you a couple of more specific questions on resilience.
Thank you. And we can actually dive deeper into all of this that you laid as a broader, beautiful picture, actually. And maybe go a little bit into the reality and how the resilience manifests in practice for you and your organizations. And I'd like to start with Grace and Nina, and then maybe Anna Isichko to tell us a little bit how was the resilience manifesting in practice for your organization in the last year? Maybe some concrete moments that you had to adapt quickly or completely change the way you work or think. Grace, you may start.
Thank you so much for that. And I think the past year, one of the things we had to navigate through was just working through ambiguity when things were unclear and there was a lot of uncertainty. And for us in that moment, what resilience meant is really, even in the midst of ambiguity and uncertainty, remaining true to who we are as an organization, the things we care about, the things that are dear to us, and not feeling that our foundation has been ripped away from us. So hanging on to that, regardless of uncertainty around funding, uncertainty around how we're going to work with partners who have been supporting, but funding for that work has come to an end. And I think some of the things in actual practice we had to do was just clearly communicate. And even communicating that we're not sure what this means for us, but this is what is happening, and being able to leverage on other opportunities. So the grant funding may have come to an end, but we have other opportunities for trainings that we can undertake for your organizations that we are supporting. There are other opportunities that are coming from other partners. So linking then the sub-grantees that we work with to those other organizations and saying that our relationship needs to go beyond a funding relationship. You know, it's a relationship that is built on mutual understanding that we want to work for communities. So for us, resilience in practice really just meant being vulnerable, being able to work through ambiguity, but also digging deep to who we are and not letting ourselves get tossed around by the wind because of situations that were happening.
Super. And Nina, would you like to add?
Sure. So the Mapping Adaptation Project spent the past few months speaking and interviewing a broad range of activists, of practitioners from the broad human rights field. And based on what we captured through more than 70 interviews, for a great part of the movement, what resilience has meant in practice this past year is something quite raw and costly. Folks described being exhausted and stuck in triage mode, not really being able to think long term about strategy or innovation, but really simply absorbing shock after shock in a very reactive mode, right? And really stuck in that reactive mode that is exhausting. So there were mentions about intergenerational fractures that were sharpened by fatigue, organizations losing staff and institutional knowledge, and also funders who really were not able to meet the moment and left civil society to manage this accelerating series of crises largely alone, right? Without creating that commitment and that bond that was expected. So resilience in this context it doesn't look like this triumphant bounce back. It looks more like collective grieving, caretaking of colleagues who were fearful and had their lives on the line, literally. And at the same time, right? This is the amazing thing. At the same time, refusing to be paralyzed, even when the tools available felt increasingly inadequate.
Anna Isichko, I feel like this might also resonate with your experience, but do tell us more.
Yeah, absolutely. For Ukraine, it's more like strike after strike, because for us, it's a full-scale war. And it's been waged in parallel physically and in hybrid dimension. We, as democracy at war, we face so many challenges, and as civil society is one of the pillars of functioning of democratic institutions, we do feel a lot of pressure. So this year was really, really complicated in terms of trying to get out of the magician's hat another stocks of resilience, because, well, our resilience is built in 5 main components, I would say: mental, physical, digital, legal, financial, and everything brings to this complex thing. But when in the middle of the winter you've got minus 20 degrees and you need to understand how to ensure your organization running, because physical security comes first, and you need to be sure that all your people, first of all, are safe, first of all, can survive, and only then you need to perform under the projects that you actually managed to gain in a pretty tough fight, because once you say it is not here anymore and there is no enough funding in the whole world, not only in the region, not only in Ukraine, organizations are really, really looking for any opportunity to scrap money. So once you've got that funding and then you've got these strikes that the whole Ukraine is freezing and trying to survive, you are thinking, oh, how do I continue as an organization? So it's always surfing between physical threats and operational and administrative threats. But if I was to take only one major challenge here, I would say it was European integration, because it's actually an existential matter, not only for Ukraine, but also for the European Union, and Ukraine in a very fast mode here. So what civil society is requested and expected to do is to support parliament and government. And in the event when there is a huge problem with human capital, there is huge problem with this demolition of physical and critical infrastructure, we are still there for our government and parliament with all the expertise we can gain, with all the context that we need to bring into this inclusive dialogue. And it is pretty challenging, because we are constantly losing our people. Some people go to the front line. Some people are killed because of the physical attacks from Russian Federation. Some are choosing to move out of the country to take care of their families. So it's a huge bunch of problems, but I think this challenge is of prior here, because we understand that while doing something locally, we still need to see what is our strategic path, strategic way. Is it highway or is it a very narrow path? So it's up to civil society also to find extra and extra resources again and again every single new day to cover the demand, to cover the expectations. So it's pretty tough challenge.
It's a very interesting combination of extremely volatile situation and future thinking that you kind of have to wrap your heads around. Hanna Toskic, I know the situation in Serbia is not that volatile, but still you have experienced a lot of moments of not only pressure and repression, but also violence in the last year. So were there any concrete examples of quick adaptations and maybe even trade-offs that you or different partners were forced to make to survive these conditions?
Yeah, trying to contextualize, as we said, wouldn't like to compare Serbia with Ukraine or any other conflict zone, but things did happen kind of like, it didn't happen overnight, obviously, but several things obviously took place at the same time. Like on one hand, there was USAID cease of funding and US funders withdrawal. And on the other hand, there has been like serious closing of the civic space, started with a student-led protest in the end of 2024, where the government's response was increased repression. And the civil society was, I would say, the easiest target in this context. We've already had, due to years and years of disinformation campaigns and targeting activities by the regime, we've already been prone to this kind of like a lack of trust, I would say, of the overall society. And there was lack of solidarity with activists and civil society and also independent media and journalists. And kind of like regime knew that. And at the point when, there was information of the cease of funding from USAID, government struck with fake investigations on the use of USAID funds by the civil society, which actually was demonstrated by the police raids in a couple of civil society organizations here in Belgrade. It took place in just a couple of days. I wouldn't call this like a trade-off, but the impact that it had on us, on my organization and other organizations, like not only those who were direct targets of these attacks, but also for all of us who've been cooperating with our colleagues and also felt it as a kind of like intimidation to the whole sector. We were in a state of shock for some time, I would say, a month or even longer, because we were kind of like waiting for the police to come to our offices and kind of preparing for this to happen, because we all had like joint projects and activities and initiatives. And at one point, I think we were not even able to do our job for, as I said, like a month or 2 months. And it was kind of like a state of freeze. But then we had some kind of like a wake-up call. We had a meeting here in our office, and it's like, okay, if they want to come, they'll come. We don't have anything to hide. We know that the purpose of these campaigns is actually like to intimidate people and to have this chilling effect, which actually took place. And, we've been training other organizations about what chilling effect is and, how regimes are, pursuing these activities. And we actually fell into this trap. But it's difficult to look from these shoes. And we said, okay, we're not going to do this anymore. So let's just continue doing what we're supposed to do and why we're here, actually. Go back to our purpose, redefine it, because the context has changed. Because there are some new actors in the field. I mean, we have the student movement, we have academia, we have grassroots movements and organizations. So we don't want to compete with anyone. We just want to be aware of what our role is to, be able to support those who can actually benefit from the expertise that we have. And try to kind of overcome this lack of trust that I've been explaining was present for some time. And that is actually still ongoing process for like the civil society sector at large. But there have been like significant improvements in that regard in last year, because obviously, we didn't solve our problems, but there has been some awakening of the wider group of citizens. And, for us, coming back to our purpose, reshaping kind of like our role, redefining and, being aware of what and who our constituency is something that actually made the change into this like mindset in the end.
You mentioned very rightfully so the more of the communities and collective type of resilience. So maybe Gabriela, a question to you: how to go about the resilience and protection beyond just the organizational one? So looking at the communities and the movements around you, and what does, from your perspective, collective resilience look like in your context?
Yeah, thank you. So we have been thinking about this, our role as a funder, a fund for global human rights in this moment. And, how we contribute to this movement support ecosystem. So there's a continuum of different organizations and inputs that come in. So how do we see that the collective? And I think it starts from analyzing. And I was listening to what Anna were saying, and the issue of being in extreme pressure, strike by strike, in an active conflict zone, that so many parts of the world are now. Interestingly, that doesn't mean that we suddenly don't have the full analysis or the more strategic approach. So what I see is that when we work on this support to organizations and movements in very repressed or even in places where there's conflict, the more strategic responses come. And it's also understanding, and this is why I was saying at the beginning of this problematic relationship with the concept of resilience, because resilience can be made to be you adapt to a circumstance. A bit, Gracie, you were saying, you adapt first, you have a trench coat and then you change it. But what about changing the weather? And so that's how we fund and connect and partner with movements who are being extremely ambitious in the most extremely difficult circumstances. And someone comes to mind that I spoke to a couple of months ago. So they are an activist who is in exile because of their situation in the country where they were active. They still work on the issues of that country. But they were saying, they are an LGBTIQ plus activist. And they were saying, none of these things of countering extreme authoritarianism and entrenched ways of dealing with things are new for us. I mean, we have this muscle as a movement that has been there for a very long time. And we also have the creativity and imagination to do much more cross-movement organizing, which is something that we are very keen to support, is to understand that all these issues intersect. And in truth, we're looking at it as a systemic moment of change. So personal resilience is necessary to cope with all the overload, but we must make sure that we are not just adapting and, making do with what is coming, but really analyzing that this is not a disconnected set of elements. I mean, these funding cuts are very much part of the strategy of reducing the oxygen for movements. And on the side of many of the governments who have been on the recipient side of these funding, there's all sorts of barriers to receiving funds and actually making this funding navigate and get to where it needs to get is actually become a hugely complex task that we believe is essential to make sure that all these elements are not cut off. There's a danger at the moment when they said, organizations are making do, they're resilient, they carry on with activities, they are really strong, and they're doing it without the funding. And I don't want to diminish that, but that's important, but it's not enough because the core of all these problems is this extreme and growing inequality. And that concentration of wealth and power is making things so the funding is not flowing. So how do we address this from all sides? And how do we also make it an issue of social justice that funds are reaching those plots? So that's the way we are discussing and thinking about that.
Thank you. And maybe a great segue for Tanya in this. So again, looking at the future and maybe changing the weather with the collective resilience outlook, how does it look from your context? And maybe if you can share, are there any trade-offs that are made along that way?
Thank you, Vanya. Well, yeah, first, I wanted to really reflect on the question of what are some of the trade-offs or decisions that our partners and we have been forced to make to survive. Interestingly, I'm provoked by what Gabriela is saying, that some of the immediate decisions to survive might also be the key or the opening of decisions to explore to really become sustainable and resilient. So I just wanted to share from what we are seeing our partners do and some of the decisions, that the choices that they've made first to survive. Of course, I think we have all mentioned it and it's top and center. Most of our partners have had to deal with moves, tactical moves, immediate moves to stop the financial hemorrhaging. And so what have they done? Someone was also mentioning it. Yeah, a lot of our partners have had to reduce their staff. They have had to implement layoffs or furloughs, of course, to align with those sudden flow of money, a sudden stop of flow of money. And I've heard from quite a few partners, or quite a lot of partners, saying like, we have had to go through a process of like narrowing our mission. And I think it also has to do with what some others are mentioning, not narrowing our mission, but narrowing our work down to the core of our mission. So that has meant to choose from programs, that are nice to have, but are not really core to their mission. And that also has to do with what others have mentioned, like, taking an ecosystemic view and saying like, what is my role in this movement? So I think Anna mentioned it, like clarifying each one's role, and Gabriela also mentioned it, is something that has been, you could see it as a tactical move, but it actually can be like a step towards sustainability and looking at the ecosystem. Of course, others have even boldly terminated grants when those grants, imposed admin costs, stress, uncertainty that were really beyond the financial benefit that they brought. But other choices that maybe are leading to longer term sustainability that we are seeing partners make is, of course, others taking steps to diversify their revenue. So really trying to move away from the dependency of funders, which that's a large, big discussion, but there are some experiments on the move. I don't know, others thinking about or distributing leadership. So instead of having one single executive director, and you all know more about that than I do, but I've seen that like increase in these days. But then talking about trade-offs and their costs, some that have been very real from where we stand or I stand. One that I would say like voice versus safety. So, going quiet on sensitive issues and, trans rights, whatever you want to think of, to remove, some of the targeting and that has a real cost, no? Like you, at some point you're removing yourself from the political conversation and your ability to shape it. And then there's other trade-offs, like, there was another question, like how compliance sometimes can shape your decisions. And I don't know if this is, but it's a question. It's more of a question, like, is compliance, antagonistic with innovation? So I don't know, like, and I'll ask some of you who are the CEOs or executive directors of your organizations, when you're spending 50% of the time of your time as a director in compliance, in this survival mode, where is the room for innovation? So I think, as you are all mentioning it, this looks very different in different contexts, in the size of the organization, in the location. But that's like some of the processes I've been observing this last year.
Super rich body of answers that we got from all of you. I have maybe one or two additional questions on the learnings, because all of you basically mentioned some of the strategic approaches or some of the very practical approaches that worked looking back and that kind of helped you with staying effective or resilient. Is there anything that you kind of looked into or tried that sounded good on paper or in theory, but actually fully failed in practice? And are there any gaps that you see that are mostly remaining unresolved? I have two Annas written for answering this, but anyone can come in.
I can start. So this may be an unpopular opinion. Okay, not financial diversification, but definitely going into the market was something that was partly successful or definitely not successful as we wanted it to be. And not only for us, but for other organizations. We've been, I can even use the word pushed by donors for some time as a sector to try to play with some for-profit models, which is okay. And we did it. And since 2014, we have kind of like our for-profit spin-off, which has never been like the main source of our funding, but was good enough as additional activity that would provide us some freedom. But I would say that, our going into market strategy should be different than the regular like corporate entities or private entities should have. Our organizations, the sector itself, and I'm speaking on behalf of my organization, but also others that I know have unique experience and unique expertise, have something to offer to the market. And this does not have to be necessarily promoted and offered as any other product, because it has its history, it has its specifics, and it should be sold as it is. Not, we shouldn't try to fit it in the existing market frameworks, because in that case, we will be just, another entity trying to play by these rules, and then we would just give up ourselves. We tried to do that at one point last year when we were, let's try everything. We had this, like, after this desperation stage that I mentioned, when we were frozen, then we had, okay, let's try everything because we're strong enough, we're stronger than ever, we can do everything. That didn't work either. So, because we tried to play by these like formal pre-set up market rules, they do not apply to us. I'm not saying that we are better than others. I'm saying that, each sector has its own specifics. Once we got back to our core, as I said, we were appealing to some, even like buyers who were like clients who were ready to buy the product, which is something that is the core of our purpose, the core of our work, not something that is, completely out of our scope. So not everyone is for core business. And I think that should be a message to donors as well. There's been a lot of activities on that regard. Not everyone should have like their merch, like their, like business portfolios. We should be able to play with different formats. But as someone said, in the times of crisis, the space for experimenting kind of decreases because you're focused on survival, and your imagination is also like now that it's high at that point. So yeah, we tried this, didn't work. Switched to some other models. It's better. It's not yet at like its peak, I hope, but it's going moving forward.
Thank you for this very honest elaboration. I'll take one gap if anybody wants to jump in. One gap.
Yeah, maybe I can I can jump in here in terms of something that sounded good on paper. But in practice, we're still struggling with. So one of the things that we said, being an organization that gives sub-grants, that we will, as much as possible, try to layer our grants to different. So what does that mean? As much as we get funding from different funders, we have one partner and we'll give them different grants to support their work so that then they can essentially have more funding and the funding can be more long-term. So it sounded really good on paper. It sounds great. We're going to ensure that this organization has larger funding and funding that can go longer. Now, in practice, one thing we didn't foresee was that we'd still have to have different funding agreements for that one partner. So the burden that came, that brought to the partners, where they're like, yes, it's funding from you as KCDF, but now we have to have different funding agreements because of the different funders we have on this other end. And so it's still something that we're trying to navigate. I wouldn't say we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater, but definitely something that sounded very easy and very nice on paper to help in terms of resilience and growing our funding portfolio to partners. But in practice, it takes a lot more than that. So the compliance burden. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Gabriela, and then Anna.
Yeah, maybe building a bit on what Anna and Grace were saying. I think on this, applying for-profit logics to this world. So there was a lot of talk about sector consolidation, when all these shocks to do with the funding crisis came in, and seemed logical to think, of course, if you band together, then things will be preserved. But I now think it's the opposite. Like in reality, for social movements and for the types of work that we all do, it's important to have some level of redundancy and some levels of differentiation as well, and also some greater nimbleness. And so in terms of related to our subject matter of resilience, so if you become a very large entity and with certain all these elements that were mentioned, like Tanya was talking about compliance or some of the other not core to the mission elements, then perhaps you become weaker rather than stronger. And so how does that more organic or ecosystem approach and how to build on strengths and be aware of others, but not necessarily. And if redundant institutions, some survive and some don't, then it means that some of the movements that are being supported will continue. And we just need to sort of be as dispersed as possible. So that's one thing that for me has changed, but I don't know how others feel about that one.
Anna, please go ahead.
A lot of thoughts that coincide, and I'm thinking also maybe it's slightly different angle, but it's a pretty big issue here for Ukraine. What's happening right now in Ukraine that we already possess pretty unique expertise in so many sectors and so many spheres that should already be exported to at least European partners and European countries, just because if Ukraine falls, they are next in a row of victims of unprovoked aggression of Russian Federation. And of course, this huge evolutionary jump, which was made by civil society, by democratic institutions in Ukraine, by our army, would not be possible if they were not our strong and supportive partners, our friends from all over the globe. And here, as a Ukrainian, I want to express our boundless gratefulness for being with us, for standing with us ever since February 24th, 2022. And we definitely hugely appreciate all the support, both financial and the moral and diplomatic and emotional support that was provided to Ukraine. We've got so many great donors and partners of regional development that support our continuous and sustainable operations. At the same time, I wanted just to draw attention to another essential thing, which would be rather described as unintended consequences of the activity of international projects in Ukraine, because they are coming here with a good cause. Again, this huge funding gap creates a situation when all stakeholders are trying to find proper solutions. And for many international projects, the solution was to arrive to Ukraine with a bigger scale and to bring more international staff and personnel and to install new programs. But actually that hurts civil society of Ukraine hugely. Our most focus should be localized support, localized development, and we do not see it. For example, when a big or even huge humanitarian project arrives to Dnipro region, Zaporizhia region, from where the evacuation is non-stop, and they've got absolutely complicated and very complex bureaucratic procedures, how to provide humanitarian aid, how to gather personal data of people whom they're helping, etc., etc., etc. So they're lagging behind. They've got resources, but they cannot provide it at local point, at local field. And unfortunately, they often don't have coordination with local initiatives. So it's good if there are strong and institutionally developed and sustainable local initiatives or umbrella organizations, which is the case, we've got them. And if there is enough luck, these umbrella organizations will notice this situation and will step in to ensure that there is coordination and a quick solution how to support each other. But in many occasions, we can see that international projects have huge resources that are not super efficiently used. And what we've been asking for already 5 years from all our partners on development is just come here, trust our expertise, and hire local experts. Not headhunt for them, not try to offer them higher salaries and bring them into international project, because it happens also these days in Ukraine, and we cannot judge people here because it's kind of practical issues. But hire people here in order to support actual civil society survival and resilience and ability to remain here after the war ends, because we all work here for just victory, for the cessation of war. But we do realize that after the end of war, we will be left here alone with our problems. And what we need, that after after all the international projects leave to settle somehow other wars and conflicts, we still need to be resilient. And how can we do if we are not getting enough tools for this, if we are not getting enough human resources for this? And that brings me also to some other things that something that worked better on paper than in reality. Well, indeed, in Ukraine, civil society is pretty strong and pretty fighting. So what I'm saying right now is actually this concept and philosophy, and it should be in practice, built into all our decision-making processes, is a fully inclusive dialogue. So when we talk about the decision-making, we need to understand that nothing about civil society would be adopted without civil society engagement. But as I've told already, we've got a huge speed of Euro integration track and process. And sometimes we do realize that the amount even of legislation that our parliament needs to pass in order to comply with the obligations under this European integration is much bigger than the ability of parliament to vote even. And that supposes that there should be a fastened procedure, simpler procedure for adopting European legislation. And then again, we are falling as a civil society out of this procedure, because faster means non-public engagement, not enough public consultations. And when it comes to details, well, it happens so that watchdogging and expertise on behalf of civil society will always notice something that will help further and later on to better and more efficiently implement the legislation. So what actually, I don't have a universal recipe here, but what Ukrainians are doing here is just that they're fighting to be in this inclusive dialogue, in those spheres where we can be constructive with a set of specific proposals and specific step-by-step solutions. We are allowed into the room. And that's the recipe: to remain active, to remain super focused on the result, on the benefits that you are trying to bring for the society overall, not be focused only on your personal organization needs, your individual needs, but just to be focused on what civil society is actually here to. Ultimate goal here is to support army, is to support us to survive, actually. So with this bigger ultimate goal, we continue to struggle for this inclusive and absolutely open dialogue. That is something that we still need to fight for. And that is something that is formally easier in any step of decision making.
Thank you so much. We touched upon a lot of issues that are connected with resources as well. So maybe, Esther, I give the floor now to you for the last part of the conversation.
Yes, we have still quite a few questions and time is running too fast, but you basically surfaced already a couple of the examples about how existing donor models are creating tensions and not necessarily responding to the real needs. I've heard you talking about how donors sometimes with good intention but pushes you to explore revenue models that are not necessarily the best ones, and how we could think about different models, the compliance burden, also the strategic thinking of how, like Gabriela, you mentioned the redundant institutions, but think less about specific organizations and more about the overall mission. And so what does that mean, even how we think about that when we all sit at different organizations? I've heard loud, Anna, what you said about how funders come in with their own programs, with their own staff, or sometimes hiring the local expertise for international programs and distorting and damaging the local civil society ecosystem. And also, I think it's not unique to your context, the fact that urgency then is again at the detriment of public participation. I have heard that a lot in the climate conversations or in many other contexts. So it almost sounds like an excuse for not having proper participation and inclusive dialogue. So we have a couple of questions here, and this is both for funders or expert civil society organizations. You can answer. But how do the risk management, compliance, and political constraints shape choices? If you are a funder, you can talk directly from that experience, or how you as a partner are seeing funders managing that. And I can take maybe one or two responses on that. The other question would be about what do funders ask, and that doesn't really match the reality. And you mentioned a few, if there are others that you want to add. And maybe an interesting question is also, what does trust look like when conditions are deteriorating and changing? Because you mentioned lots of very hard decisions that must be taken. So what does really trust means there?
Yeah, maybe we can start on what funders tend to ask. And then there's a whole sort of area of funding that is all about measuring impact and very distinct times and maybe sort of categories and funding by sector. So, from our perspective, we see that, project cycles are, of course, artificial projections on reality, and it's much more in line with movements and the messiness, I suppose, of social change to talk about much longer funding periods. And some funders do that, and we do that, but we do hope that it's something that becomes more the norm for this type of civic space organizing, that it requires patience, understanding, and also it requires a holistic approach. So the things cannot be packaged for one or another, and that takes a lot of time and unnecessary time. So in reality, that links to your other question of trust, because in the end, it's whose strategy is it that we want to support, and we believe it's the strategy and the perspective of someone who is on the ground, on the front lines of what they're seeking to transform. And ideally, they have that lived experience. They also see something from their perspective that is contributing to systemic change. And for systemic change, they need to also be allowed to experiment. Like in your previous question, many things won't change. It won't work the first time. And if you don't have the possibility of trying and failing, then the likelihood that something innovative will come or that something transformational will happen is lower. So it's around funding. Like, we really want this to be transformed, and that we understand that it takes time. So that's, I think, it's the long term, really unrestricted in the sense that it's adaptable to whatever are the priorities seen by those who are best placed to act on them. And that is the most strategic, is to really be responsive to strategies that are very contextually and driven by lived experience.
Thank you, Gabriela. And I see Nina would like to add as well.
Yeah, no, that what Gabriela was saying resonates a lot with what we heard. That desire, that need for an actual space to experiment with genuine permission to fail and mechanisms, right, to share that. what the learning collectively. I think there is a real desire in the field for peer connection and a level of exchange that is not structured around performance or reporting to funders, that is not guided by funders' views on what the priority is and what the priorities are, right? Like Gabriela was saying, I think a trust on what organizations and movements on the field are seeing and are doing. I think it's really highlighted. It's been highlighted as something very, very necessary at this moment.
Thanks so much for that. And Tanya, do you want to add very quickly on that as well?
Yeah, I wanted to add, I could echo verbatim what Gabriela said and what Nina said. Patient money, money and investment in resilience that is driven by local needs. Patient money, also the room to experiment, to fail, to learn. I echo all of that. But I wanted to go back to one of the questions in the outline that was referring to what are we most worried about for the next year? And, I've been thinking that there's like a transition gap. So I think we have all acknowledged that we're sort of stuck between a broken past or a model that we know is not working and a future that hasn't been built. And no, we're operating on a 20th century, so to say, financial model, but under this new reality, which is the permanent crisis, the permanent uncertainty. So all of what you've described, the old model being project-based, short-term donor-driven, all of that, that's broken. And we know that was eroding resilience in a way, but we don't I think we are all sure that we will come up with a new paradigm. It'll take time, as you were saying, it'll take time. But this interim, I feel like we don't have a transition strategy where we can at least try. I don't want to say make sure, but at least try that we don't lose in this interim all that we have already gained, or at least preserve a good part of it. So I just wanted to leave that there. I think we do need to think on that new paradigm and try to make room for the innovation and room based on trust. But I think we have to think specifically of what's that transition strategy.
That's coming together very nicely from the problem to where we should be heading. And Anna, you want to add?
I just want to refer to compliance, actually, which we kind of avoided as a question in risk management. For us, compliance actually was one of the elements of building resilience. And, working with other organizations who needed support in, aligning their operations with legal requirements. They didn't have resources for that, and we provided it. And it worked pretty well. And I think it made us more prepared to be able to fight against unnecessary and unlawful forms of, I would say, oversight and regulation when it comes to work of civil society. The challenges are still great, but we kind of use this to also build our experience, in different legal fields, being the organization gathering mostly legal professionals. So we found it as an element of resilience. But again, as I said, being able also to see where is the line, where are we actually, leaving the compliance field and becoming just obedient to whatever the rule is, even when the rules are not just and proper. And having all said, and especially can comment what Anna was saying about the approach of donors, especially when it comes to large international interventions and donor programs, not being that locally focused. I think that also contributed to the stage in which we actually, as a sector, got into this crisis unprepared and being mostly reactive. And still even with this time difference, not being proactive enough for us to be able to dictate the trends, to dictate the topics, to dictate the issues that are relevant for citizens and for us as a sector, rather than, just reacting on whatever the states are commenting as the topics are. And I think that kind of produces a lot of frustration within the sector, and that, we still need to work on strategies on how to actually take over the game, take over the narrative, and actually be proactive.
Thank you so much for that. And I would like to ask Vanya to take us to a kind of distilling from diagnosis to possibilities for action. Do you want to guide us to that terrain?
So one of the questions can be for the future possibilities and actions based on all that we've heard so far. Maybe question for you, Nina, is there any models that you would identify as something that could be used in the short term and could be scaled?
I think from what we've been hearing and seeing in the field, I think there are no real models emerging, and I think there is actually feedback we've been receiving on the need to look beyond models because it's all very contextual. But there is a consistent refusal to be frozen and a consistent recognition that the old tools are losing their edge. So I think we are hearing again, right, that need for space to experiment, that desire for pure connection, and really conditions to build their muscles, among activists and organizations, build their muscles on whatever adaptation and innovation means, right? If it's really working with what they have to change the weather, as Gabriela well put it, but really being able to keep moving and to keep building the change, right? Not with prescribed solutions, but with inspiration and room to think together. So that collective element is very present, very much present. So I think for when it comes to funding, I think we all know this, right? The desire and the request for flexible, trust-based, risk-tolerant funding. I think it's always there. And I think having that commitment at scale, I think maybe that is the model we should be looking at and looking for. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nina. A great ending from your side. Briefly going to Anna Isichko first, right?
We'll try to be brief. I wanted to first echo to Anna's words as to more efforts to impact donors' agenda. I cannot support more because starting from 2021, we as organization and some partner organizations, we tried to change the landscape and architecture of security agenda of civil society organizations. We really believe into the need of developing a proper culture of taking care of your security in all dimensions. So it's already a couple of years that donors are supporting organizations and are providing funding for conducting security audits, for creating security protocols in whatever dimension is necessary for civil society organization. It's not a big money, it's not a huge line in the budget, but it's already there, and it's already it's the beginning of tectonic shift, we hope. And as for resilience, I think we did not touch a very interesting thing like artificial intelligence. What we are trying to do here in Ukraine is to motivate and to bolster this new approach that artificial intelligence is not more also a tool. It's already our environment. And that's already something that we need to start thinking of how we transform and shape this environment for us to be extremely resilient. Because as we've all mentioned a lot of times, it's highly turbulent and unpredictable and very shaky world in terms of geopolitics and political situation all over the world. So it's worth thinking into where we can get that extra resources if we use artificial intelligence environment for our benefit. Thank you.
Thanks. Gabriela, you have your hand up?
I'd say, it's holding on to hope. So investing in hope, we say it's around this, even in the darkest moment and where civic space is the most retrenched, to continue with an abundance mindset and framework. That is, it's of course important to resist, but you're resisting because you're imagining and you're co-creating in a collective what the day after will be, that day after when the opportunity comes, and that, not to let go of that belief and that imagination that we collectively have. And that, so it's in a sense of having the mental strength, resilience to navigate the moment, but not to accept or adapt and let go of the belief that another world is possible, that we're here to transform. And that's what we can do together. Movements, funders, it's a collective effort, and it's one where having the common vision is the driving force.
I love how all these ideas resonate with each other. Grace, do you want to add something maybe?
Yes, I'll actually pick up from where Gabriela has dropped off. Really keeping the vision and the dream alive, even when it seems darkest. So even when there's so many oppositions or opposing voices or very difficult situation, I think the key thing around resilience is not giving up. You might not be the one who lives in the time when everything is perfect, but I strongly believe we all have a role to play. And the role we play within the moment of crisis is to keep on pushing and keep on doing what we're doing. So collective organizing is key, really, to help us build resilience. Thanks.
Thank you, Vanya, Esther, Yeri, and everyone for the opportunity to have this conversation today. To finalize, I would like to say a little bit about what it means to fund resilience. And I think we are talking about a fundamental shift where we move from a transactional approach to a relational one that is grounded in trust. It means recognizing that the partners on the ground, those who are living the reality of shrinking civic space, are the best judges of what they need to survive and thrive. So our job as funders isn't to draw the map for them. It is to provide that patient money that we have been talking about, that flexible, multi-year fuel they need to navigate a territory that is being constantly redrawn. So when we think about this, it means that we're not just funding a project or projects. It means that we're helping our partners to grow a reserve of autonomy, because this reserve is their ultimate protection. It gives them the power to say no, for example, to compromised agendas, and ensures that they remain accountable first and foremost to their own constituencies rather than to us, the funders. And we choose this path because we believe that resilience without independence is more like a sophisticated form of compliance. So one way to look at it is thinking of true resilience as the infrastructure of sovereignty, of agency, of the voice that they have built for years. And it is our responsibility to invest in that independence before the space to do so disappears.
Esther, anything to add at the end?
Thank you so much. And we will not have time for a full recap and a closing reflection. So I will just close by saying I've heard out loud that resilience is really about not just protecting the moment, but not giving up to keep the dream alive. It is collective, political, and it's long-term. And I want to thank you all. I wish we could stay here and have a much longer conversation, but we will, I'm sure, continue at another time. Thanks so much, everyone.